Okay, again with a super unflattering angle. Sorry, I don't have a hoist. This is how I got to get things done here.
All right, what's up everyone? Dave here, Stance Everything, back out in the garage, and today we are going to measure for the two-piece drive shaft for my 1951 GMC truck. For those of you who have found this video by searching on YouTube, my truck is a 1951 GMC that is on air ride. Because of the way that it lays out, if I had a single piece drive shaft, it would hit the bottom of my cab. So to fix that, I'm going to run a two-piece drive shaft rather than tunneling my cab and making a big transmission hump, because the interior of my truck is pretty much ready to go. I've done all the rust repair. I don't want to go through and modify that much if I do not have to. To get around that, a two-piece drive shaft, it's a pretty simple concept. I will have a carrier bearing somewhere around there, and the drive shaft will be straight from the transmission to that roughed-in cross member, and then it will pivot before it gets to the diff. A few videos ago, I thought I measured for this correctly. I will show you what I did measure and then talk about what I have to actually do to make sure that this drive shaft works. So previously I did do some measurements to see if I could measure for this drive shaft, and what I got was 54¼ overall length, 32 then revised to 29 for the front section, and then I didn't actually measure the rear section. After talking to a couple drive shaft shops, they told me that I need a couple more measurements to make things work. So I need the measurements of the yokes front and rear. I have a Spicer slip yoke in the front, so figuring that out shouldn't be too hard. I believe it's a 1310. But in the rear, I might have a 3R, which is one that works with a retaining clip. Don't worry, I will show you how to measure for that later in the video. And then I also need from the transmission yoke to the carrier bearing, which actually I didn't know that I needed it to the bearing and not where I want the joint to be. The joint will obviously be a little bit after the bearing. And then from the bearing to the rear differential. I have all of these listed here. So transmission to carrier, carrier to diff, diff yoke, trans yoke, and I also need to measure my suspension travel, which is what we're going to do today. The reason that I'm going to do my suspension travel today is because I do not have a plumb bob out here right now or anything to make a plumb bob with, so I have to go inside. By the time I go inside and find something, it'll just be easier for me to come back another day and do it. And to do that with a plumb bob, what I'm going to do, because I made this little cross member here, it's just sort of mocked up, I'm going to drill a hole in the middle, run the plumb bob down, and I'm going to use that as a reference for all my measurements, and that can just slide around and it's going to be perfect. It's going to get everything kind of exactly where I need it to be. So in lieu of me going inside and grabbing a string and something heavy to make a plumb bob, instead today we're going to measure my suspension travel, and then we're going to come back another day and bang out the rest of the measurements. Should be able to do that all in one night. This video actually probably won't end up too long, but hopefully it is informational for anyone who is looking to order a two-piece drive shaft for their project, or anyone who just wants to see me fumble around with the tape measure and look like I know what I'm doing. So if it wasn't already obvious, my truck is in the air, and you're probably wondering how I'm going to measure for my suspension travel with the truck in the air. Well, right now it's at full droop, so I know that is the fully raised height, which is limited by my shocks. And then I do know that when this truck lays out, the running boards hit the ground first. So if I jack up the rear end until everything is parallel here, then that is essentially my suspension travel, which won't be too hard for me to do. But before I do that, I had to think of a point to measure for reference, and I'm actually going to use the bottom of this yoke to the ground. I am going to see what that measurement is before I jack it up, and then do a little bit of math, and the difference will be my total suspension travel, which should work just fine for the measurements. I don't think that the rear end really needs to go much higher than the wheels even, but I will probably just give it just a little bit more travel just in case, because if I switch out wheels, I don't want anything to kind of just throw it out and have to get a new drive shaft if I end up switching out wheels that have a slightly different diameter. So let's do a little bit of measurements and see where we end up. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Getting under the truck here with my ruler level, you can see that the bottom of this is about 13 inches. So I am going to jack this up, see where it ends up, and then I'll take another measurement, and then we'll be able to figure out our difference. I'll also make sure to check that measurement when I air it out, just to make sure that everything seems good there. My next measurement, it's about 18 inches on the top of there. So I know I could call it 19. I'm probably going to call it 18. just because the drive shaft guy did let me know that if I have too much travel, I got to use some off-road stuff, and that might get really expensive. So I think we are good with that measurement. Back at my board here, I've got my initial, which was 13 minus 18. That's -5. So the difference in travel is going to be 5 inches in total. And that's what's going to need to happen at that joint there. We're going to need about 5 inches of travel just to accommodate for airing up and airing down and having everything working out. So I just realized there's one other thing that I can do before I go get a plumb bob. And that is going to be measuring for the yoke that goes in here. Like I said, I think it's a 3R. They have a retaining clip in here. Actually, this one doesn't seem to have a retaining ridge. So I'm going to have to measure this, and we can figure out what size this is and what size universal joint I need to work with this differential. All right, everyone, it's been a couple of days since I last started to measure for my drive shaft. I've taken some time to sort of get a few things together to make this a little bit more straightforward to explain. In the last part, I did measure the travel of my suspension, which is honestly pretty much the easiest part. Just had to cycle it a little bit. I do have the rear end jacked up right now in about half travel, just to take some more of the other measurements that we need for the drive shaft. Remember, the measurements that I need for the drive shaft are, I need the transmission to the carrier where I want the center bearing to be. I need from the center bearing to the rear end, and then I need to measure the yokes on either end. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to use to get all those measurements, and then we're going to walk through actually getting them, so that this video can be a little bit instructional, a little bit more instructional than some of my other videos. Don't take it for gospel. If you do follow this, you should get pretty close. Obviously, you are going to just need to confirm with your local drive shaft shop that this is everything that you need. Okay, on my bench here, I have everything that I'm going to need to take my measurements. I have an electric caliper, a measuring tape, and then this cool little tool from SKF that you can use to measure yokes. I did actually try and use it to measure my yoke. I have a bit of a special yoke that this didn't work out quite right, but it did work for the transmission yoke. So I'll show you that while I'm underneath the truck. Obviously, you could do all of this with just a measuring tape, but this is free, and this I already had. Another important part of my measuring puzzle is that I have put my cross member in place. I've drilled a hole and run a string with a nut on the end as a plumb bob so that I can use that to take my measurements. I've also marked this with marker and C-clamped it so that if it ever does get nudged around, I know exactly where I want it to be. To make sure that this was square from side to side, I took a measurement from my middle cross member to the end of this new cross member. It was just about 9 inches on either side, so I've got that all sorted out. It's even side to side so that I can take a measurement from here. Obviously, before I drill some holes and bolt this in, I will triple check to make sure that that measurement is where I want it to be, but this is more than solid enough to get my drive shaft measurements, because the carrier is obviously going to be mounted to this. It's going to clear my cab because my cab is right there. The joint for the drive shaft will be about here, and then we'll have a drive shaft going from there to there. It'll all work out really quite well in the end. So let's get to measuring a few things so we can figure this all out. Okay, so unfortunately, the way that my back half is, there isn't really a great spot for me to put the camera and be able to capture everything in one go here. So we're going to do this twice. I'm going to do one measurement from the plumb bob back here, which is behind this cross member, to the end of this yoke here, and then we'll go down at the bottom. You'll see me do it from sort of the underside, confirm everything, measure twice, cut once, you know what I mean, and we'll go from there. So first, let me extend this out here to my plumb bob, and I'll lock it in because I know it's going to be less than 31 inches. It's at my plumb bob now, and back to the differential. It's looking like that is about 27¼ inches. Now, obviously, I want to verify this a little bit more thoroughly, so I'm actually going to pop my measuring tape here because I can get it nice and flush and go the other way and just verify that I am at 27¼ inches. So I've locked that in there against the end of the yoke, taking it back to my plumb bob, and from the top here, it looks like 27¼ is exactly where it's at. Just one measurement, got to go down to the bottom and verify it there as well. So sorry for the weirdest, most unflattering angle of me ever, but this is my plumb bob. I've got my differential back here, so I'm just going to run a measurement from the end of this
to there and make sure that it matches the 27 1/4 that I got up top there. So we're back to the diff. We're nice and square, and we're just a hair under 27 1/4 this way. So I think I'll actually call it maybe 27 1/8 to just be bang on specific. Now this measurement underneath here is a lot more trustworthy because I have this right bottomed out against the diff and it's straight back to the plumb bob. Just let that stop rattling a little bit. Yeah, it looks like we're about 27 1/8. We might split the difference there because there's going to be a slip yoke used for the carrier. Sorry, there's going to be a slip yoke that exists here too, so we're going to have a little bit of play there for when the suspension goes up and down, but I think we're pretty good with that measurement. So the next measurement we need to do is from the transmission slip yoke back to this plumb bob. Okay, again with a super unflattering angle. Sorry, I don't have a hoist. This is how I got to get things done here. I've got my slip yoke in the transmission now. The transmission shop said to make sure that my slip yoke is 1 inch out of my transmission. So I measured 1 inch from the end of my transmission to the flange here on my slip yoke, and then I've got this rubber around here as well. So that's the way that I've got this set up, and I'm going to measure from the end of this to my plumb bob. So if I go from the end of my slip yoke right there to my plumb bob, I am at dead on 26 inches in length. So that is again from the end of it to the plumb bob. If I went from about the middle of it, I am at 27 inches. So I'm going to give the Driveshaft shop both of those measurements just to make sure that they have all the information they need to make their best judgment on the two measurements that I gave them. So again, we're 26 or 27 at the middle. So we're on the bench here, and I pulled the transmission yoke out of the transmission so I can show you how this this cool printout thing from SKF works. So if I grab the right one here, you hang this on the outside of the lug for a full round shaft. It says on this thing here, it says distance across lugs on the popular series. So you want to hang this on the end, measure it across to the lug, and so if I do it from lug to lug here, this goes across to 1350, which is right there, which is a very common size. It's an HD size. I think it's a pretty big size. Luckily though, I'm bringing this to the Driveshaft shop, so this is not super crucial to my measurements, but I am going to note it down here on the piece of paper that I am using to record everything. The next step is to measure the yoke that is on my rear end, so I'm just going to write this down here so that I know. I'm going to measure my rear end one, and then we'll have all the measurements that we need. Okay, so the last measurement I need to take is for my rear end yoke. You'll notice I have something on here off a website that I'll link in the description that kind of gives you the measurements of all the different snap style ones that I have. I know that my rear end is not going to be a 1330 or anything like that. It's going to be an inside snap ring style rear end because it looks like this style. Hopefully this is all showing up on camera. If not, I will add some pictures when I do this video. And the way that you can figure this out is measuring this width from sort of inside to inside. To do that is where I'm going to end up using this. Now I know this is a 3R because I looked it up beforehand online for an 88 9-bolt rear end. It's a 3R GM, and the width is going to be 2 9/16. So let's just go over and verify that on the actual rear end and make sure everything is good. Okay, so the last thing we got to do here is measure the distance from this tang on my rear end yoke to this tang. The measurement for a 3R, which is what I believe to have, is 2.563 millimeters. So I've got my digital caliper here, and I am going to see if everything matches up. So let's put this in here and see how it lines up here. So get this across. Okay, we are pretty good. 2.550. Now, this is a Mastercraft caliper. There's a little bit of paint on here.
I think we're close enough to the 2.563 that it needs to be. I'll lock it in one more time just to make sure. Okay, 2.559. I think that is going to be close enough with this tool here, given that there's some paint in here and you know, a little bit of stuff in the way. So I'm going to say pretty confidently that we have a 3R snap ring yoke on the end of my transmission. So now we have all our measurements, and I've captured them on the whiteboard. So transmission to carrier is 26, carrier to diff 27 1/8. The diff yoke is a 3R, the trans yoke is a 1350, and my suspension travel is 5 inches in total. That does differ from when I initially measured this at 32 and then 29 inches. So I am glad that I moved my transmission crossmember where I wanted it to be, put a plumb bob in, triple checked all of my measurements to make sure that everything is on point and what I need. I'm going to take those measurements and my transmission yoke to the Driveshaft shop, and they are going to make me out of Driveshaft. I am going to talk to them a little bit about the way that I took the measurements just to make sure that everything is on point, and of course I took a couple of photos as well. Then my Driveshaft should be ready in not too long, and we can bolt that into the truck. In the description of this video, I will include links to all of the tools that I use, that SKF calculator, that website that I showed on my phone there, just so that if you are doing this, you can check things out too. Really, you could do this with just a measuring tape and a lot of time. I used a couple of resources that were available to me just because why not? It's my first time. Driveshafts are not cheap, and I want to make sure that I get the right one the first time and don't have to shorten it afterward. So hopefully you found this video informative. I know that I didn't do any cutting, welding, grinding, airing up, starting, or anything like that, but it's definitely something that I need to do to get this thing moving forward. So we can go back to the board here. I can now recheck off measure for Driveshaft. And now that we can recheck off measure for Driveshaft, we can get the truck rolling down the street. So thanks again for watching this video. We'll be back next week with another one. See you then.